My superior's memo lay damp on the table, ink smudging under the stamp saying, "No unauthorized devices." I kept my head down and my hands busy, twisting wire in the dim light until the metal cut my cold fingers. I set the rusted shovel where the lane forced wheels to commit, then walked away as if it were ordinary scrap. When the scout car stopped hard at the blind bend, the paperwork started moving and my name stayed off the tag. In late 1944, in a rural sector of Western Europe, though the fighting had tightened into small movements along the minor lanes. The main roads were watched. The fields were cut by ditches, the hedges made walls. Armoured reconnaissance used the narrow tracks that looked harmless on a map and decisive in real mud. The operational situation was simple to describe and difficult to live. One side held a thin line with infantry and a few support elements. The other side sent scout cars forward to feel for gaps, not always to fight, to look, to listen, to make the line react and reveal itself. Those lanes were the kind that forced a vehicle to commit. A blind bend with hedge and bank, a choke point where two vehicles could not pass, a stretch where the ground stayed firm on one side and swallowed wheels on the other. Reconnaissance crews learned these places the way men learn the floorboards of a dark room. Commanders wanted control over anything that could explode. They wanted diagrams, they wanted marked lanes. They wanted logs and signatures and a clean chain of custody. They wanted mines that were recorded and recoverable. They wanted the risk contained inside procedures. Improvised traps were not contained. They were built from scrap. They were hard to brief. They were easy to forget when rain wiped footprints clean. They could harm friendly patrols. They could trigger inquiries that did not care about intentions, so prohibition circulated, typed sheets with uneven letters. Carbon copies that stained fingers black. A stamp pressed down hard because ink was thin. A signature that looked like it had been written on a shaking knee. The paper moved in a predictable path, from a field office where a clerk sat under blackout curtains, to a runner's pocket, to a dugout table where a lamp was shaded with cloth, to a board where orders were pinned with bent nails. The wording was cautious and sharp, no unauthorized devices, no unrecorded charges, and no field improvisations that could not be cleared. It sounded like the voice of someone thinking about tomorrow's friendly casualty report. The soldier in this story was not a man whose name travelled far. Records do not preserve it clearly. If it appears anywhere, it appears in the edges, in wording that hides responsibility. A soldier. Personnel. An individual acting without authorization. His role was one of the roles that rarely appear in polished summaries. He handled wire. Then he handled scrap. He helped prepare obstacles and repairs close to the line. His work was the kind that left mud under the nails and cuts on the knuckles. His routine began before daylight settled. A kettle warmed on a small heat source. The water tasted of tin. He folded a damp map and smoothed the crease with his thumb. He checked a pocket for cord and found it stiff with dried mud. He did not carry a neat kit. He carried what could be carried, and a length of wire that had already been twisted once. A small pair of cutters that pinched rather than sliced. A stub of pencil tied to string so it would not vanish into darkness. A rag that never got clean again. The ground dictated everything. Rain made the lanes shine in a dull way that meant trouble. A wheel rut filled and looked shallow, until a boot stepped in and sank. A ditch that seemed minor became a black line that swallowed sound. Though reports about enemy scout cars did not arrive as dramatic announcements, they arrived as routine complaints. A sentry heard an engine at the wrong hour. A patrol saw fresh tyre marks where none should be. A field telephone line was cut again, as if someone had timed it to the moment repair parties would expose themselves. The scout cars did not always fire. Sometimes they simply appeared at the bend, paused and withdrew. And sometimes they sent a short burst into hedgerow branches and watched for movement. Sometimes they drove just far enough to force the defenders to show where they were. It wore down the line in small, expensive ways. A man stayed awake longer than he should. Another wasted ammunition on a shadow that moved like a branch. A runner took a long route because a lane no longer felt safe. A repair party worked lower to the ground, shoulders wet, hands numb. Commanders responded by doctrine. Unauthorized mines where permitted. Wire obstacles where the ground allowed. Patrol schedules, sentry rotations, all of it proper on paper. But doctrine depended on time and tools. Time was short, tools were scarce. The authorized minefield might be planned for a place that mattered less than the lane the scout cars actually used. Permission lagged behind movement. The soldier saw the pattern because he walked those lanes for practical reasons. He walked them to check wire. and he walked them to judge where mud would swallow a vehicle. He walked them because someone had to and because someone else might not come back. He noticed where vehicles naturally chose to travel, not where maps said they could travel, where they actually did. A narrow track with firmer ground on one side, a blind bend that reduced long sight lines, a shallow dip that hid a vehicle's silhouette for a few seconds. He also noticed where friendly troops avoided going unless forced, and a lane that was technically passable but unpleasant, a route used mostly by the enemy because it sat in an awkward seam of attention. When the prohibition against improvised devices was read out, he listened without arguing. There was no point. The reasons were real. An unmarked trap could kill a courier. A tripwire could catch the wrong boot in fog. A device could remain after a position shifted, waiting for the next set of friendly feet. He had seen mishaps, not always fatal, and often worse in a quieter way, a shattered hand that ended at a man's usefulness, a wounded friend who had to be carried and could not be carried quickly, a report that did not name the builder, only the consequence. He kept the warning in mind, he also kept the lane in mind. The problem escalated. The scout cars came with more confidence. They seemed to know the defenders' rhythms. They appeared when patrols were changing. They tested the bend that forced a vehicle to slow. They withdrew before heavy fire could be brought to bear. The line began to feel watched. Not in a dramatic way, in the way a man feels when he stops talking because he realizes someone is listening outside a door. He saw the limits of the authorized tools. Official obstacles required coordination. Coordination required messaging. Messaging required lines that were cut. Requests went upward and came back stamped, delayed, conditional. In that narrow gap between doctrine and mud, as he began to assemble an idea, he did it without announcing it. He did it while performing tasks that looked ordinary. Scrap was everywhere, a broken crate strap, a bent bracket, wire pulled from an abandoned fencing, bits of metal that were too small to be worth reporting. His shovel was old, the blade pitted with rust, the handle cracked and wrapped with tape that peeled at the edges. It had been used for everything that required leverage and scraping. It was not treasured, and yet it was simply present. That shovel became part of a crude tripwire trigger. Not because it was symbolic, because it was flat, because it could act as a lever and a weight, because it already looked like a useless object left near a lane. He worked in a cramped space where light was controlled, a dugout or shelter where smoke clung to damp timber, a shaded lamp that threw the kind of dim yellow that makes hands look older, a ration tin used to hold small parts so they would not roll away. Yet he straightened wire with careful pulls. The wire bit his fingers. He paused to warm his hands in his breath and kept going. He tied knots in cord and untied them because the cord swelled after rain and changed tension. He tested the movement again and again, not with pride but with the stubbornness of someone who knows the first failure will be the only chance. The mechanism was simple, a low line stretched across a predictable path, and a crude catch that would release or pull when the line was struck. The shovel blade as the practical heavy piece that kept the whole thing seated in wet ground. What it would set off, if anything, remained described in cautious terms even in later retellings. Wartime documents often avoided details about improvised charges. When they did mention them, they used bland language. A charge, an explosive component, an ignition element. It was partly censorship. And it was partly the habit of officers who did not want a copycat problem spreading without control. It was also the simple fact that people at the scene rarely knew every component with certainty. He did not pretend certainty either. He built what he could build from what was available. He planned for a single function. He focused on one purpose, to stop a scout car in a place where it could not easily recover its advantage. Placement mattered more than cleverness. He walked the lane again, had alone when possible. He watched where water flowed. He watched where tyres left consistent marks. He watched where a driver would drift away from a rut. He watched the blind bend where the hedge rose high, and where a vehicle had to slow if it wanted to stay upright. He chose a choke point. Not a wide, dramatic clearing, a narrow stretch where a vehicle's options shrank, a place where a scout car would commit because backing out would be just as risky and slower. And he thought about friendly movement. He remembered which lanes were used for supply and daylight and which were avoided. He remembered where patrols tended to return. He picked a place where friendly troops were unlikely to pass unless the situation had already turned strange. He also planned for removal. If it had to be cleared quickly, it should be found quickly by someone who knew where to look. That knowledge was risky. It had to stay close. not in a written note, not in an open briefing. Yet he carried the components like any other small job, the shovel on his shoulder, a coil of wire in a loop, cord tucked into a pocket, his posture calm enough that no one would pause to ask questions. He reached the choke point with a careful pause. He listened first. The lane held its usual sounds: distant movement, wind in hedges, a faint mechanical clink somewhere behind the line. He set the shovel blade into the ground with a shallow scrape. He did not dig deeply. The deep digging would look fresh. Fresh earth was a sign. He seated it in existing mud and debris, so it blended. He laid the tripwire low, not high enough to be seen easily, low enough to be struck by a wheel or a lower part of the vehicle's front. He kept it tight, then loosened it slightly because too much tension would break it when the ground shifted. He tested the line with a stick. A small movement, a slight pull, the mechanism responded. He adjusted it again because wet cord and cold metal behave differently than they do in a sheltered space. He stepped back and looked at the lane as an enemy driver would see it. A muddy track, a bend, a ditch line, a shovel that could be mistaken for abandoned equipment, a wire line that disappeared into the visual noise of wet grass and dark soil. He erased obvious signs of his presence. He stepped in older tracks where possible, and he brushed a patch of disturbed grass with the back of his hand. He did not leave straight lines of scuffed earth that would catch attention. Then he left, not quickly. Quickness draws eyes. He left with the same pace he used when doing ordinary work. He returned to routine and waited. Waiting was never passive. It was the act of continuing other tasks while keeping a corner of the mind fixed on a specific bend in a lane. He repaired wire in a different place. So he wiped mud from his cutters and found that they still pinched. He ate from a tin with a spoon that scraped the bottom too loudly in quiet hours. He watched a clerk trying to keep the papers dry by turning them under a coat. The line remained tense. The scout cars had not disappeared. They were expected. Expectations in war are sometimes worse than surprises. On a grey day with low visibility, sound carried oddly. Engines could be heard and then lost. Bootsteps sounded close and then turned out to be farther away. He heard an engine note approach the lane. Not a heavy column, not a convoy. A single vehicle, maybe with another behind it at distance. The sound was steady, controlled, a reconnaissance sound. He did not rush toward it. He stayed where he belonged. Men who rush become targets. He held still and watched the bend with peripheral attention, not a stare. The armoured scout car came into view at the blind corner. It had moved with the confidence of a crew that had used the lane before. It hugged the side where the ground was firmer. It kept speed enough to be safe from small arms, but not enough to lose control on the bend. The tripwire met it low, the wire snapped tight, the crude mechanism shifted, using the shovel blade's weight to keep its seat. The device functioned the way field devices either do or do not, without drama and without mercy. The vehicle halted sharply, not a gentle stop. And a hard check that threw weight forward, mud spat from tyres. The scout car's movement stopped where it did not intend to stop. Accounts written later described the effect rather than the mechanics. According to reports, the reconnaissance vehicle was immobilized at the choke point. The reasons were described in cautious language. Some suggested damage at the running gear. Some suggested a charge functioned beneath a vulnerable area. And some used the flat wording of bureaucracy. Vehicle stopped and unable to continue. What mattered tactically was immediate. A scout car stopped in a narrow lane loses its freedom. It cannot easily turn, it cannot retreat quickly. It becomes an object trapped by geography. Infantry nearby reacted with the practiced economy of men who have done this before. They moved to cover, they used banks and trunks, they signalled with hands close to the body, they did not shout. As shouting wastes air and reveals position, the exchange was short and harsh. Small arms fire, a burst, then a pause, then another burst. The vehicle's engine note changed, strained, then reduced, as if the crew were trying to decide what to do next. No one stood upright to confirm a result. The lane could still be watched by the enemy. A second scout car could appear behind the first. A dismounted team could be nearby. After a brief span of time measured in breath and heartbeat rather than clocks, the lane fell quiet again. The immobile vehicle remained an obstacle. Even if it was later abandoned or recovered, its stop had already done something important. It broke routine. Reconnaissance depends on routine more than most people admit. Drivers follow the safe tracks. Crews trust familiar bends. Commanders count on predictable probing. When a safe lane becomes a trap, the whole pattern shifts. Her men came to the site cautiously after the immediate danger eased. Not a crowd, a few at a time, keeping low. They examined the mud marks and the wire. They found the shovel blade. They saw the crude trigger with scrap metal and cord. The first reaction was not applause. It was a tight look exchanged between men who understood what it meant. It meant the ban had been ignored. It also meant the scout cars had been stopped. Someone collected the remains like evidence, a sack or a cloth wrap, and cord tied around it, a tag attached with a loop of string. The tag's writing blurred where fingers were wet. A chain of custody began, even in the mud. Because once an officer sees a device that was not authorized, the officer thinks of paperwork. Not out of cruelty, out of survival inside a system that punishes surprises. The device was taken back, not displayed, not celebrated, placed on a table where a lamp could be angled toward it. A clerk nearby tried to keep forms flat on damp wood. Her ink thickened in the cold and made letters uneven. Reports began their climb. First the spoken report, then the written note, then the typed version with official phrasing, then a signature, then a stamp. The language changed as it moved upward. At the scene, men spoke plainly. A wire. A shovel. It stopped them here. In writing, those words became safer. An expedient trigger. Scrap components. Enemy reconnaissance vehicle immobilized. The soldier did not put his hand up for credit. Credit would require a name. A name would require an explanation. An explanation would require someone to decide whether this was initiative or insubordination. He stayed close enough to listen, far enough to avoid being singled out. He cleaned mud from his boots with the same shovel that now had a different history. He dried his hands on a rag that only spread dirt. He watched officers lean over the table, the device between them, like a problem. The pushback arrived in procedure, not in a public dressing down. A request for details, a demand for who placed it, a reminder of standing orders, a formal reprimand, if it existed, would have used predictable phrases: unauthorized action, risk to friendly personnel, deviation from doctrine, requirement for reporting. The phrasing would be tight, and as if tightening language could tighten behavior. At the same time, reality pressed in from the other side. The scout cars had been using that lane. Authorized measures had not yet stopped them. A crude device had stopped at least one. That contradiction made doctrine flexible in the quiet way institutions become flexible. No one wanted to say out loud the ban was wrong. They wanted to say the ban is still correct, while quietly shifting how strictly it applied. And so the conversation changed shape, not openly, in lowered voices near a stove that smoked, in a half-sentence while a map was being folded, in a gesture toward the bend in the lane. An officer might insist on marking and coordination. A senior man might insist on keeping any measures close to no choke points and away from friendly routes. That no one would say build more rusted shovel traps. They would say deny lanes where enemy vehicles commit. They would say use expedient measures under supervision, a phrase broad enough to cover the real act without blessing the word improvised. The soldier watched how language softened. He watched a clerk add a line to a daily log template. He watched a stamp appear that said something like restricted, used more often when the subject was uncomfortable. And he's watched paperwork swallow detail because detail could cause trouble. The lane itself became a different place. It was now suspect. The enemy would approach it with caution or avoid it altogether. That meant reconnaissance pressure shifted to other tracks. That shift carried consequences. A different hedge line became watched. A different ditch crossing became risky. Men had to learn new patterns and new danger, which is how the front constantly demanded attention. Friendly troops also had to adapt. They had to clear the area carefully. They had to check for remaining wire. They had to make sure no unrecorded device waited for a friendly foot. Clearing took time. Time meant exposure. Exposure meant a quiet kind of fear that showed in tightened movements and fewer words. The soldier's risk became personal in a restrained way, not as melodrama, as a simple calculation every time he saw an officer's gaze settle on a tool, and as a small pause when someone asked casually, who said that? As the knowledge that if a friendly casualty occurred, the tone of every memo would harden. He did not build a legend around himself. He returned to routine work. He handled wire and scrap as before. He kept his tools orderly because disorder invites attention. He kept his movements ordinary because ordinary movement disappears. The institution responded the way institutions often do when field improvisation works. And it tried to absorb the lesson without praising the breach. It emphasized choke points in obstacle planning. It emphasized better mapping of vehicle approaches. It emphasized reporting and marking. In some cases, that meant more paperwork, more forms, more signatures, more stamps pressed into damp paper, more carbon copies that left black smudges on the fingers of tired clerks. In other cases, it meant a subtle shift in practice. Patrol leaders began to think more like drivers. They considered where a vehicle would slow, where it would commit, where it would be unable to turn. They placed authorized obstacles with more care. They watched blind bends more closely. The rusted shovel itself became an object with two lives. It was still a tool. It still scraped mud, but it also carried a private meaning for those who had seen it used as a trigger. They would not speak of it loudly. They would glance at it and remember the abrupt stop in the lane. Later reports, and if they survived, would not frame it as heroism. They would frame it as a field incident. They would use safe words, they would avoid exact mechanics, they would avoid names. They might conclude with a recommendation that sounded like doctrine: ensure denial measures at likely reconnaissance choke points. That is how many unsung wartime acts exist in the record. Not as stories, as phrases, as clipped sentences meant to be filed and forgotten. The soldier did not require a citation in a newspaper. He did not receive a tidy commendation for a rusted shovel trap. Commanders would not have wanted that attention. Improvised devices were politically awkward, even inside an army. They threatened the appearance of control. The legacy was quieter and more practical. The lane stopped being easy. The enemy's reconnaissance became less casual there. The defenders learned that a vehicle's habits could be used against it. That even when resources were thin, it also left a small imprint on how doctrine was spoken. Never became rarely. Prohibited became not without coordination. The words changed just enough to allow reality to fit inside them. In the weeks that followed, men continued to do what infantry always does. They checked wire in rain. They dried paper near heat that barely warmed. They sharpened pencils with knives meant for other work. They folded maps until the folds turned white and fragile. They listened for engines in the same hedged lanes and tried to guess intent from sound. The war did not pause for paperwork. The paperwork did not stop either. Both continued side by side, a clerk stamping forms, a soldier tying knots in cord, a commander trying to keep control, a scout car probing for weakness. In that narrow space between instruction and mud, a crude tripwire built around a scrap and a rusted shovel had forced a concession. Not an announced change, a quiet flexibility. An unspoken acceptance that denial at choke point sometimes comes first and doctrine catches up later. If you want more restrained, overlooked wartime stories like this, consider subscribing.